She was supposed to last 1 season. That was the deal. Cook through the harvest, mend what needed mending, and be gone before the first hard freeze locked the roads. Nobody told the winter that. And nobody told Ivy Sutton that the man who'd hired her was half out of his mind with grief, running a cattle operation held together with baling wire and stubbornness, and that the ranch she was riding toward, bumping along a wagon road that barely deserved the name, was less an established homestead and more a dare someone had made against the Wyoming landscape. She found out soon enough. The wagon driver who'd taken her from Cheyenne dropped her at the fence line, pointed north, said, "That's the Alderman place," and turned his horses around without another word. That should have told her something. Ivy Sutton was 24 years old, 5 months out of a teaching position in Columbus, Ohio, and the only woman on a road that ran straight into the kind of sky that makes you feel very small and very far from anyone who knows your name. She picked up her bag, one bag, a canvas satchel her mother had stitched, and she walked. The ranch house appeared when she crested a low rise, and it was not what she had pictured. She'd pictured something modest but solid. This was something else. The main house had good bones and the remains of white paint and a porch that leaned west like it was tired. 2 outbuildings, a barn that looked more recent than the house, a water pump, a kitchen garden gone to seed. And standing in front of the barn, watching her walk up the road with an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever, was Gideon Alderman. He was taller than she'd expected, which wasn't a surprise, and colder than she'd expected, which also wasn't a surprise. What surprised her was how worn he looked. Not old. He wasn't 35 yet, but weathered in the particular way of a man who's been carrying something heavy for a long time without setting it down. He looked at her bag, then at her, then back at the road she'd walked from, as if calculating whether it was too late to send her back down it. "You're the schoolteacher," he said. "I was," Ivy said. "Now I'm whoever you need me to be." It wasn't the answer he expected. She could see that. He didn't know what to do with it, so he turned and walked toward the house and said, over his shoulder, "Kitchen needs work. You'll figure it out." That was the welcome. The kitchen did need work. It also needed supplies, a working flue, a butter churn that wasn't cracked, and someone to scrub 16 months of bachelor living off the walls. Ivy spent her first 3 days doing almost nothing but cleaning. She didn't complain. She'd grown up the oldest of 6 children in a house where complaining was a luxury nobody had time for, and she understood that the fastest way to earn standing in a new place was to simply make yourself useful and wait. What she noticed in those first days was that Gideon Alderman had 2 ranch hands, a quiet older man named Del who spoke mostly to the horses, and a young Mexican cowboy called Tomas who laughed easily and kept to himself, and that neither of them looked at her with anything but relief. They'd been eating whatever they could manage on their own for a long time. She made biscuits the first morning, and Del ate 4 of them and said nothing, but the set of his shoulders changed entirely. Gideon ate in silence. He came in, sat down, ate what was put in front of him, and left. He said thank you the 3rd morning, which Ivy counted as progress. She learned the shape of the grief from small things. A pair of women's boots by the back door, too small for her and too worn to give away. A quilt on the parlor chair that had been folded and unfolded so many times it was soft as skin. A Bible on the shelf with a pressed flower inside and a name on the flyleaf, Ruth, written in different handwriting than Gideon's, his wife. Gone 14 months before Ivy arrived. A fever, Del told her one afternoon, not meeting her eyes. A fever in October, and then the winter had come, and Gideon had just held on, the way some men do. Not because they decided to, but because the cattle still needed feeding and the mortgage still needed paying, and grief doesn't excuse you from any of it. Ivy understood that kind of grief. She didn't try to fix it. What she did was keep the kitchen clean, keep the meals hot, keep the garden from dying completely, and start, slowly, quietly, to see where the ranch was losing ground. She had been a teacher. She knew how to observe. She watched Gideon's ledger books when he left them on the table, and she saw the numbers, and she said nothing for 2 weeks. Then one evening she set a cup of coffee in front of him, and sat down across from him and said, "You're underselling your beef." He looked up. "By about 12 cents a pound," she said. "Hartley's been buying from you since you took over the ranch. He's been paying you the same price for 3 years, while the market rate's gone up. Either he doesn't think you're watching, or he doesn't think you care." Gideon set down his pen. "How do you know the market rate?" I asked at the dry goods store in town. Ivy said, "Mrs. Pruitt's husband runs the freight operation. He knows prices." The silence lasted long enough that Ivy wasn't sure if she'd overstepped. Then Gideon said, "You went to town?" "I walked. It's 7 miles. I had questions." She picked up her coffee. "You should renegotiate with Hartley before the fall sale. That's $800 you're leaving behind." He stared at her for a long time. She met his eyes and didn't look away. "I'll think about it," he said. He renegotiated the following week. Hartley didn't push back. Men rarely push back when they've been caught at something. After that, Gideon started leaving the ledger books where she could see them. It was not a quick thing what happened between them. It wasn't romantic in the way stories usually are, with a single moment that changes everything.
It was slow, the way trust always is.
It built in the margins of ordinary days, in the evening hours when the work was done and the lantern was lit, and there was nothing left to do but be in the same room with another person.
Gideon started talking.
Not about Ruth, not at first, but about the ranch, about what he'd hoped for it, about his father who'd broken this ground and what it had cost him.
Ivy listened.
She was good at listening, and somewhere in the listening she started talking too, about Ohio, about her students, about the particular loneliness of being a woman who thinks clearly in a world that finds that inconvenient. He laughed the first time in November. She'd said something dry about the rooster, who'd decided the kitchen windowsill was his territory, and Gideon Alderman laughed, just once, short and startled, like he'd forgotten he knew how, and then looked almost guilty for it.
Ivy didn't make a thing of it. She just filed it away.
The first real trouble came in November too. A man named Cutter Vane arrived at the ranch on a gray Tuesday morning with 2 men behind him and a land survey in his hand, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was the kind of man who'd learned that doing legal harm is safer than doing illegal harm, and he'd been working the county for years, picking up distressed properties, pressing on weak spots, waiting for the moment a rancher was tired or broke or alone enough to fold. He'd been watching the Alderman place for 2 seasons. He was reasonably confident the time had come. He was wrong. What Cutter Vane had not accounted for, what nobody who looked at the Alderman ranch from the outside had accounted for, was Ivy Sutton. When Vane laid out his survey on Gideon's kitchen table and started explaining the discrepancy in the eastern fence line, it was Ivy who asked which survey company he'd used. When he said Haverford out of Laramie, it was Ivy who asked whether the Haverford survey had been registered with the county before or after the territorial boundary correction of 1883. When Vane blinked and said he wasn't sure what she meant, it was Ivy who went to the sideboard and produced a folded document she'd gotten from the county recorder's office 3 weeks earlier, because the fence line had looked wrong to her on the ranch's original deed.
Haverford got the elevation datum wrong, she said pleasantly. On the eastern slope, it happens with the older surveys.
The corrected boundary actually runs 14 feet further east, which means the fence line is where it should be, and the strip of grazing land you're claiming is still part of this ranch.
Cutter Vane looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Ivy.
She's right, Gideon said, though he'd had no idea
She was right until 30 seconds ago.
Vane left. Not quickly. Men like Vane don't move quickly, it looks like retreat, but he left. Gideon waited until the wagon was out of sight. Then he turned to Ivy and said, "When did you go to the county recorder's office?"
3 weeks ago, she said. I had a feeling. You had a feeling.
The stakes on the eastern fence were newer than the rest. Someone had moved them recently and tried to make it look old.
I wanted to know why.
She folded the document back up. I made 2 copies. One's in town with Mrs. Pruitt's husband.
I thought it was safer that way.
The way he looked at her then was different from any way he'd looked at her before.
It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more unsettled than that. Something like recognition. He said, Ivy. She said, it's your ranch. I just work here. He said no and didn't say anything else for a long time.
The thing about almost losing something is that it clarifies what you'd been too stubborn or too scared or too broken to see. Gideon had spent 14 months holding on to the ranch because it was what remained of the life he and Ruth had planned together, and somewhere in that holding on he'd stopped thinking about what the ranch could be. He'd been surviving it, not building it.
And here was this woman
who had walked 7 miles to town on her own initiative, who'd copied legal documents out of a quiet instinct for trouble, who fed his hands like they mattered, who said things clearly and without apology, and she had been building it the whole time without him noticing. He noticed now. He started asking her things. What she thought about the south pasture, whether the kitchen garden could be expanded, whether the ranch should consider taking in a small herd over winter for a neighboring operation in exchange for a fee. Ivy had thoughts about all of it, and she shared them, and some of them were wrong and some of them were right, and they argued about the difference, and the arguing was good. It was the kind of arguing that builds something instead of tearing it down. December was brutal. A storm came off the mountains and locked them in for 11 days, and the 3 of them, Gideon, Ivy, and Dell, with Tomas wintering with his family in Pueblo, kept the cattle alive through it mostly by working through the night in shifts and refusing to lose anyone.
They lost 4 head. They saved 60.
On the last night of the storm, sitting in the kitchen with frost on the inside of the windows and hot coffee going cold in their hands, Dell looked at the 2 of them and said, "Ranch hasn't felt like a ranch in a while," and then went to his bunk without explanation. Gideon sat with that for a moment.
Then he said,
He means it's felt empty. I know what he means.
Ivy said. It doesn't feel empty now. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the frost on the glass, at the dark outside where the storm was finally dying. No, she said, it doesn't. She almost left in the spring.
Not because she wanted to, but because the job she'd been hired for was done, and she had been a schoolteacher before she was a cook and a bookkeeper and a land dispute investigator, and there was a teaching position opening in Rawlins, and she was practical enough to know that wanting to stay somewhere is not the same as being asked to. She started packing on a Wednesday in March. Gideon found out from Dell, who found out because he'd seen her canvas satchel by the back door, and he came to the kitchen in the early morning when she was making bread and said, without any kind of preamble,
You're leaving. I'm considering it, Ivy said. She kept her hands in the dough. The teaching position, he said. It's a good position. The school in Rawlins has... Don't, he said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and put both his hands flat on the table. Don't tell me about the school. She looked up. He was not a man who said things easily. She knew that about him now. When he spoke, it was because the alternative was worse. When Ruth died, he said, I thought I understood what I'd lost, and I did understand it. But what I didn't understand, what I couldn't see until you were here, was that I'd stopped expecting anything. From the ranch. From myself, he looked at his hands. From the days. The bread dough was rising under her palms. Outside, a meadowlark was doing something optimistic. I'm not Ruth, Ivy said. No, he said. You're not, and I'm not asking you to be. He looked up then. I'm asking you to stay. To help me build this place into what it should be. And I know it's not the kind of thing a person just agrees to. Yes, Ivy said. He stopped. Yes, she said again, because the word felt right, and she'd always believed in saying clearly what she meant. I'll stay. He let out a breath he'd been holding, she thought, for longer than that morning. They were married in June, in the parlor, with Dell and Mrs. Pruitt and the county recorder, a man named George Ansell who'd been amused by Ivy ever since she'd shown up at his office asking pointed questions about elevation datums, and a preacher from the church in town who had to ride 2 hours each way, and said it was worth it. Cutter Vane made one more attempt that summer. He'd found a lawyer in Laramie who claimed the original homestead filing had an error in the description. The lawyer wrote a very formal letter. Ivy wrote back a longer and more technical letter with supporting documents and carbon copied the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. The lawyer did not write again. Gideon read her response letter over her shoulder and said, Where did you learn to write like that? I taught language arts for 3 years, she said. Precision matters. The south pasture was fenced and rotated by the following spring. The kitchen garden was doubled and then doubled again, and by the second summer, Ivy was selling surplus to the dry goods store and to 2 of the restaurants in town. A small schoolroom was built onto the back of the ranch house, and 2 evenings a week Ivy taught the children of their nearest neighbors, reading, arithmetic, a little geography, and charged nothing for it, because she was a teacher, and she knew that education spreads in a community the way a good well spreads, underground and in all directions at once. Dell took on a second hand, a quiet young man from Texas named Birch, who turned out to be gifted with horses and terrible at conversation, and exactly what the operation needed. What the Alderman Ranch became over those years was not dramatic. There was no single moment of transformation. There was just the accumulation of good decisions and honest disagreements, and mornings where the work was hard and the work still got done, and evenings where 2 people sat across from each other and said what they actually thought, in the gradual, unspectacular, extraordinary way that a failing thing becomes a thriving one when someone refuses to stop caring for it. Ivy Alderman. She used the name without sentiment and without ceremony, the way she did most things. Learned to read cattle the way she'd learned to read students, by paying attention to the small signals, the ones that come before the obvious ones. She made mistakes. She was wrong about the south pasture rotation the first year, and Gideon was right, and she said so plainly, and they fixed it together. He was wrong about the price of a second stallion in their 3rd year, and she said so plainly, and he thought about it for a week, and then he said she was right, and they didn't buy the stallion, and the money went into fencing instead, and the fencing was exactly what they needed. She had been hired to last a season. She was still there 20 years later, with 3 children who were all impractical in different ways she loved. One of them obsessed with botany, one who wanted to go to law school, one who could fix any mechanical thing put in front of her, but lost her shoes with a frequency that defied explanation, and a ranch that was one of the better operations in that part of Wyoming, and a husband who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to say what he felt when it mattered. On the evening of their 19th anniversary, sitting on the porch that had long since been re-leveled and no longer leaned west,
Gideon said, I never asked you that first day. What made you walk up that road? Ivy thought about it. The road had been dry and long, and the sky had been the particular blue that Wyoming does in September, enormous and impersonal.
I was tired of waiting to be asked,
She said. I figured if I was going to build a life, I might as well start walking toward one. He reached over and took her hand and held it the way he'd learned to, comfortably and without making a production of it. The meadowlark was at it again somewhere in the south pasture, the kind that stays late in the season, past when you'd expect it. Some things don't leave when they're supposed to.
and in the end, that turns out to be the whole story.